long period of time, Wu Yifan existed in a space very few people in Cbiz ever reach. He was not just famous. He was protected. That distinction matters because in this industry, fame can be negotiated, but protection changes the rules entirely. At his peak, Wu Yifan was positioned as a symbol rather than an individual performer. He carried commercial value, international appeal, and a carefully managed public image that aligned with multiple interests at once. This alignment is what creates protection. It is not granted openly, and it is never announced, but its effects are unmistakable. Controversies did not escalate. Criticism rarely traveled far. Consequences, when they appeared, were contained. Protection does not mean perfection. It means insulation. Within that insulated space, mistakes do not immediately translate into loss. Media narratives are guided. Brands remain confident. Platforms continue to amplify. The system absorbs friction so the figure at the center does not have to. Wu Yifan's status reflected this clearly. He moved freely across music, film, fashion, and endorsements, supported by an infrastructure designed to sustain visibility rather than question it. His presence was normalized at the highest level, where attention is not earned daily but maintained through stability. This is the phase audiences often misread as invincibility. But invincibility in Cbiz is never personal. It is conditional. It exists only as long as protection remains intact. And protection is not loyalty. It is an arrangement. Understanding this distinction is essential, because what follows in Wu Yifan's story is not a sudden collapse of fame. It is the moment when an arrangement quietly reaches its limit. Protection in Cbiz is often mistaken for loyalty. In reality, it is conditional and transactional. It lasts only as long as alignment remains intact between image, value, timing, and the system's broader need for stability. When that alignment weakens, protection does not break dramatically. It thins. In Wu Yifan's case, the signals were subtle. His position still looked secure on the surface, but the environment around him had changed. The industry was becoming less tolerant of figures who generated uncontrollable risk. What once could be managed quietly now carried higher cost. Protection at this stage becomes selective. This is where the logic shifts. The question is no longer whether someone is influential, but whether they are worth defending. Systems do not act out of sentiment. They assess exposure. They calculate impact. And when the cost of shielding someone begins to outweigh their utility, protection quietly loses priority. Importantly, nothing needs to be announced. There is no warning. No formal downgrade. From the outside, everything appears unchanged. But internally, the calculus has already moved on. Support becomes conditional. Silence replaces intervention. The safety net is still there, but it is no longer guaranteed to hold. This phase is often invisible to the public because protection does not disappear all at once. It recedes, and by the time it is truly gone, the system has already prepared for what comes next. When the protection finally disappeared, it did not do so gradually. It ended at once. What followed was not a debate, a negotiation, or a period of uncertainty. It was immediate alignment across platforms, institutions, and media channels. This speed is the clearest indicator that the decision had already been made. At this stage, individual actions no longer matter. The system does not need to argue or explain itself. Once protection is withdrawn, response becomes automatic. Visibility collapses not because of public pressure, but because no one is instructed to hold the line anymore. Silence turns from a defensive tool into a signal. What is striking is how little resistance appears. There are no counter-narratives, no attempts at delay, no gradual distancing. The same structures that once absorbed risk now step aside completely. The figure they once stabilized is suddenly exposed, and exposure in Cbiz is unforgiving. This moment is often misunderstood as chaos. In reality, it is order reasserting itself. The system moves to contain uncertainty, not to assign morality. Once a figure is no longer protected, continuity matters more than reputation. Stability matters more than history. For Wu Yifan, this was not the collapse of fame. It was the end of authorization. And without authorization, presence cannot be sustained, no matter how visible it once was. What followed the withdrawal of protection was not merely retreat, but a far more decisive action: erasure. In Cbiz, erasure is not emotional and it is not symbolic. It is procedural. It operates through routines, compliance, and coordination rather than announcements or explanations. Once a figure is deemed too risky to remain visible, distance alone is no longer enough. The system does not simply stop promoting. It begins to remove. Names are taken off platforms. Past content quietly disappears or becomes inaccessible. Brand associations are severed without statements. Credits are adjusted. Search results thin out. None of these actions require public justification because they are framed as standard operational responses. What makes erasure particularly effective is how distributed it is. No single institution appears to make a definitive decision. Each platform, each partner, each organization acts independently, yet the outcome is perfectly aligned. This is not coincidence. It is how coordination looks when it is designed to appear natural. The intention is not to punish an individual, but to stabilize the environment. Visibility creates reference. Reference invites discussion. Discussion creates unpredictability. Erasure interrupts that chain. By reducing traceability, the system limits the ability of a removed figure to continue existing within public memory as a current presence. Over time, absence replaces controversy. Without new material, without reinforcement, attention decays. What once felt dominant becomes distant, and because erasure happens without debate, there is no moment of collective reckoning, only quiet adjustment. In Wu Yifan's case, this process unfolded with unusual clarity. His disappearance was not partial and not ambiguous. It was comprehensive, and once erasure is enacted at this level, it does not function as a pause. It functions as a conclusion. Once erasure begins, intervention becomes nearly impossible. Not because no one notices, but because no one is positioned to stop it. In Cbiz, power is not centralized in a single figure who can reverse a decision. It is distributed across platforms, institutions, and unwritten rules. When alignment is reached, resistance has nowhere to land. At this stage, silence spreads quickly, not as agreement but as self-protection. Brands withdraw because association now carries risk. Media avoids coverage because uncertainty invites scrutiny. Industry peers step back, not out of cruelty but out of calculation. Speaking up does not restore protection. It only transfers exposure. This is the moment many observers misunderstand. They ask why no one defended him, why allies disappeared, why influence seemed to evaporate overnight. The answer is structural. Protection is not transferable. Once the system decides not to carry a figure anymore, individual loyalty has no leverage. Intervention would require someone to assume responsibility for the risk, and that role no longer exists. What replaces defense is distance. Silence becomes a signal of alignment, a way to demonstrate compliance without declaration. In this environment, even neutrality is read as intention. To say nothing is to stay safe. To say anything is to invite consequences. Wu Yifan's isolation was not personal abandonment. It was systemic withdrawal. The system did not need to instruct people to stay away. The incentives were already clear. When protection ends, the absence of intervention is not a failure of courage. It is the final confirmation that the decision has settled. This is why erasure holds. Not because it is enforced, loudly but because no one is positioned or willing to challenge it. Wu Yifan's disappearance is often framed as a moral story, a cautionary tale about personal downfall, but that framing misses the deeper lesson. What his case ultimately reveals is not how an individual falls, but how a system restores control when protection is withdrawn. In Cbiz, existence at the highest level is conditional. It is authorized. As long as that authorization remains, visibility is sustained and risk is managed. When it ends, the system does not negotiate. It removes continuity. Careers do not collapse slowly. They are concluded administratively. This is why Wu Yifan's erasure felt so complete. It was not driven by outrage alone, nor by a need to make an example. It was driven by a requirement for stability. The system chose predictability over history, containment over explanation. And in doing so, it demonstrated how little individual stature matters once authorization is revoked. The most unsettling aspect of this process is its efficiency. There is no public debate about proportionality, no discussion of redemption. Once erasure is enacted, time does not lead to reconsideration. Absence becomes the new normal, and memory adjusts accordingly. Wu Yifan did not simply lose his career. He lost his position within the system's present tense. His story marks the point where protection ends, erasure begins, and existence itself becomes conditional. This is not just the story of one figure. It is a case study in how power operates in Cbiz, and how quickly it can decide that someone no longer belongs.